The old black man stood silently arranging medals in the funeral home. Sheriff Miller burst in, hand on holster. What's a man like you doing with military honors? The air froze between them. One man with decades of service, another with immediate suspicion. In the quiet funeral home of Millfield, Colonel William Marshall, 65, meticulously arranged a display of medals and photographs. His weathered hands moved with precision, each placement deliberate. The afternoon light filtered through stained glass, casting colorful shadows across the memorial. He prepared for his fallen brother in arms. Sheriff Miller entered with heavy footsteps that violated the sanctity of the space. His eyes narrowed upon seeing Marshall, a black man in simple civilian clothes handling military memorabilia. Miller's hand instinctively shifted toward his holster. This is a restricted access area during preparation, Miller announced, voice unnecessarily loud. What's your business here? Marshall turned slowly, his posture straight despite his age. I'm preparing a service for Major James Kendrick. His voice carried the calm dignity of someone accustomed to both command and restraint. The sheriff circled Marshall, eyes scanning the medals. Funny, I don't recall any black officers in Kendrick's unit. How exactly did you know him? We served together in 3 deployments, Marshall replied evenly. Miller snorted. Anyone can claim military connection. You got permission to handle these items? I do. Marshall continued his work. From who exactly? Miller demanded, stepping closer. From his family and from the funeral director, Marshall said, meeting Miller's gaze without flinching. Well, I think we need to verify that, Miller replied, reaching for his radio. Too many people claiming military honors these days, especially people who don't look the part. I'll need to see some identification, Sheriff Miller demanded, positioning himself between Marshall and the memorial display. Marshall reached slowly into his pocket, producing a simple wallet. Here's my driver's license. Miller examined it dismissively. William Marshall, doesn't tell me anything about your supposed military connection. My military ID is not required for civilian identification, Marshall stated calmly. The sheriff's eyes narrowed at the response. I'll need to inspect that box you brought in. He pointed to a polished wooden case bearing military insignia. That contains personal effects and honors for the memorial service, Marshall explained. It's private property. Not when there's reasonable suspicion, Miller retorted, reaching for the box. Marshall's hand gently but firmly covered the lid. Sheriff, I must decline. These items belong to a decorated soldier who served this country with distinction. They deserve respect. Remove your hand, Miller ordered, voice rising, or I'll consider this obstruction. A funeral home assistant appeared in the doorway, visibly uncomfortable. Is everything all right, Colonel Marshall? Do you need anything from Major Kendrick's service? Miller's head snapped toward the young man. Colonel? Yes, sir, the assistant nodded, confusion crossing his face. Colonel Marshall has been arranging everything since yesterday. Miller's expression hardened rather than softened. Well, Colonel, if that's accurate, you should understand the importance of verifying identity and authority. I understand protocol very well, Sheriff, Marshall replied. I also understand dignity and respect for the fallen. Step away from that box, Miller insisted. Military property requires proper handling. These aren't government property, Marshall corrected him. These are personal medals, photographs, and a flag presented to his family. We'll let county verification determine that, Miller said, reaching for his radio. I'm calling for backup to secure these items. 2 deputies arrived within minutes, their expressions shifting from alertness to uncertainty as they assessed the scene. An elderly black man in civilian clothes standing calmly beside a memorial display, and their agitated sheriff. Sir, step away from those military items, Miller commanded, gesturing to his deputies to approach. Marshall remained perfectly still. Sheriff, may I ask what crime you believe is being committed here? Possible stolen valor, impersonation of military personnel, unauthorized handling of military honors. Miller listed off, though his voice carried less conviction now. The funeral director, Mr. Hawkins, hurried in. Sheriff, what's going on here? Colonel Marshall has full authorization to prepare the service. So everyone keeps saying Miller replied dismissively. Where's his military ID then? Anyone can claim to be a colonel. Marshall sighed softly. If you insist. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a Department of Defense identification card. Miller snatched it, examining the card with obvious skepticism. These can be faked. Call the number on the back, Marshall suggested, his calm demeanor unbroken. As Miller scrutinized the ID, Marshall's mind drifted to similar encounters throughout his 40-year military career. The gas station in Virginia, where, despite wearing his uniform, the attendant called police suspecting a stolen credit card. The military ball where he was repeatedly directed to the service entrance despite his dress blues. The countless times he'd been asked if he was really an officer. This says Marine Corps, Miller noted, suspicion still evident. Kendrick was Army. Different branches served together often, Marshall replied. We met during joint operations in Desert Storm. Miller stepped back, keying his radio. I need verification on a military ID. Name, William Marshall. Claims to be a Marine colonel. The funeral director interjected, Sheriff, this is unnecessary and disrespectful to Major Kendrick's memory. Miller ignored him, focusing on his radio conversation, describing Marshall's ID in detail. After a moment, the radio crackled. Sheriff, that ID series is high-level clearance. Where exactly are you calling from? Miller's expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. I'm at Hawkins' funeral home, Miller replied into his radio. Got a subject claiming military rank, handling honors for the Kendrick service. The dispatcher's voice came back with a distinctly different tone. Sheriff, please confirm. Is this individual identifying himself as William Marshall, Marine Corps? That's what his ID claims, Miller answered, watching Marshall with narrowed eyes. A long pause followed. Sheriff, stand by. We're receiving verification calls. Miller's brow furrowed. Verification from whom? No answer came. Instead, the funeral home's phone rang. Mr. Hawkins answered, his expression shifting from concern to surprise. Yes, he's here. Yes, sir. Of course. Right away. He hung up, looking at Miller with newfound resolve. Sheriff, that was the mayor's office. They requested this matter be resolved immediately and with appropriate respect. Miller's face reddened. The mayor's office? Why would they? Because, Marshall interjected quietly, word travels quickly when misunderstandings occur. One of the deputies, younger than Miller, had been studying Marshall's posture, his bearing, the quiet authority in his eyes. Sheriff, he said cautiously, I think we should return the colonel's identification. Miller hesitated, then thrust the ID back at Marshall. This doesn't conclude our investigation. Marshall accepted his ID with dignity. Sheriff, I've stood watch over brothers who never made a home. I've carried their caskets. I've folded their flags. All I want now is to honor my friend with the respect he earned. The simple truth in these words hung in the air. The younger deputy stepped back respectfully, a gesture not lost on Marshall. Miller, however, persisted. If you're really who you say, why are you here alone, without uniform, without escort? Seems unusual for someone of supposed rank. I'm here as James' friend, not for ceremony, Marshall replied. The official honors will come tomorrow. Convenient explanation, Miller muttered, though doubt had begun to creep into his voice. The tension was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Car doors slammed outside the funeral home. Through the windows, they could see two black SUVs with government plates and a military police vehicle. What the hell? Miller murmured, moving toward the entrance. Marshall remained beside Major Kendrick's memorial, straightening a photograph with gentle fingers. The funeral director intercepted Miller at the doorway. Sheriff, perhaps we should de-escalate this situation. I'm doing my job, Miller insisted, though his confidence was visibly wavering. The front door opened. A uniformed Marine captain entered, surveying the room with practiced efficiency. His eyes found Marshall, and he immediately stood at attention. General Marshall, sir, we received notification of a situation. Miller froze. General? The captain's eyes flicked to Miller, then back to Marshall. Yes, sir. Major General William Marshall, retired, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, former commander of the 2nd Marine Division. Marshall sighed. At ease, Captain Reynolds. This is unnecessary. 2 more Marines entered, along with a civilian in a suit who immediately approached Miller. Sheriff, I'm Special Agent Thompson, Department of Defense. We need to speak privately. Miller stood stunned, looking between them and Marshall. General? But you said Colonel. I didn't say anything about my rank, Marshall corrected gently. Others assumed. The funeral director nodded. He's always been Colonel to us. It's how he introduced himself years ago. Captain Reynolds addressed Marshall with deep respect. Sir, the secretary called personally when he heard. Your security detail is concerned you left without notification. Marshall smiled slightly. I don't need a security detail to honor an old friend, Captain. Miller's face had drained of color as the reality of his mistake began to dawn on him. The man he'd been threatening with obstruction charges and accusing of stolen valor was not only legitimate, but held one of the highest military ranks possible. The room had transformed. Where moments before Sheriff Miller had commanded authority, he now stood awkwardly as Marines positioned themselves respectfully near Marshall. Agent Thompson returned from his brief conversation with Miller, whose face had taken on an ashen quality. General Marshall, Thompson said, We've clarified the situation with local law enforcement. Your privacy will be respected. Captain Reynolds approached Marshall with a leather portfolio. Sir, these are the finalized arrangements for tomorrow's service, as you requested. The Joint Chiefs send their condolences. 3 former presidents have confirmed attendance. Miller's eyes widened further. Marshall reviewed the documents briefly. Thank you, Captain. Please ensure the family's wishes remain our priority. A woman in Air Force dress blues entered, saluting Marshall sharply. General, the flyover is confirmed for 1,400 hours tomorrow. The Thunderbirds are honored to participate. Marshall nodded. Major Kendrick would appreciate that. He always loved watching them. The funeral director approached cautiously. General, I had no idea about tomorrow's scale. Should we make additional preparations? Everything is handled, Marshall assured him. I wanted to arrange this personal display myself. James was my friend before he was a decorated officer. Miller remained frozen in place, watching as more military personnel arrived, each showing profound respect to the man he'd nearly arrested. Agent Thompson turned to Miller. Sheriff, I believe your presence is no longer required. Miller struggled to find words. I was just doing my job, making sure what exactly? Marshall interjected, his voice still calm but carrying unmistakable weight. For the first time, his full military bearing became evident. The straight spine, the commanding presence, the eyes that had directed troops in battle. I've been denied access, questioned, and disrespected throughout my 43 years of service, Sheriff, Marshall continued. From my first day at Annapolis to my final command, I've been asked to prove myself in ways my white counterparts never experienced. He gestured to the memorial display. Major Kendrick never saw my color, only my capability. When our unit was pinned down in Fallujah, he didn't question whether a black officer could lead the rescue mission. When I was nominated for my first star, he supported me against substantial resistance. Captain Reynolds added quietly, General Marshall has commanded over 25,000 Marines and has been awarded every major combat decoration our nation offers. Marshall shook his head. That's not important now, Captain. What matters is honoring James. Miller looked down, the full weight of his prejudice finally visible even to himself. I apologize, General. I made assumptions that were unwarranted. Marshall studied him for a moment. Assumptions, Sheriff Miller, have cost many good soldiers their lives, in battle and sadly at home. Sheriff Miller stood at the threshold of the room, caught between leaving and staying, between pride and humiliation. The military personnel moved efficiently around him as if he were merely an obstacle, focusing entirely on General Marshall and the memorial preparations. Miller began, but the words evaporated. What could he say? That he'd assumed a black man couldn't possibly hold high military rank? That something had seemed off About Marshall from the moment he saw him? Marshall looked up from the display. He was arranging. You know, Sheriff, Major Kendrick faced similar skepticism when he recommended me for command. People questioned his judgment. Miller shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I didn't mean to disrespect. You meant exactly what you did, Marshall interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. The question is whether you recognize it. A photograph on the memorial table caught Miller's eye, a much younger Marshall in desert camouflage, arm around Major Kendrick, both covered in dust but smiling. We had just evacuated a village before artillery struck, Marshall explained, noting Miller's gaze. Saved 87 civilians. James never mentioned in his report that I disobeyed a direct order to do it. Miller swallowed hard. You served together long? 30 years, on and off. Different branches, same wars. Marshall straightened another photograph. When I was captured in 91, James led the rescue operation personally, refused to leave despite orders. The weight of these revelations pressed down on Miller. This man he'd treated with suspicion had lived a life of extraordinary courage and service. My father was military, Miller offered awkwardly. Always taught me to respect the uniform. The uniform? Marshall raised an eyebrow. Or the person wearing it? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Agent Thompson approached. General, we should prepare for the secretary's call. Marshall nodded, then turned back to Miller. Sheriff, tomorrow this room will hold some of the highest-ranking officials in our government and military. They're coming not because James was a major, but because he was a man of character who judged others by their actions, not appearances. Miller nodded, words failing him completely. The next morning, Sheriff Miller stood across the street from the funeral home, watching a procession of black vehicles, the honor guard in immaculate uniforms, the flags fluttering at half-mast throughout the town. He remained out of sight, both by choice and by the not-so-subtle suggestion of Agent Thompson. From his vantage point, he observed General Marshall greeting dignitaries with quiet dignity, a president, Supreme Court justices, military commanders with chests full of medals similar to Marshall's own. Yet Marshall's focus remained primarily on Major Kendrick's family, his gentle hand on the shoulder of Kendrick's widow, his respectful interactions with the children. The local newspaper editor approached Miller. Quite a scene, isn't it? General Marshall arranged everything, but kept himself out of the spotlight. Did you know he and Major Kendrick integrated their unit in the 70s? Faced death threats, but never backed down. Miller didn't respond. The general requested no media inside. The editor continued. Said it wasn't about him or the dignitaries, just about honoring his friend. As the last guest entered, Miller noticed a young black Marine lieutenant being directed to a special seat near the front. The Marine's bearing reminded him of Marshall. The same quiet confidence, the same dignity. That's Marshall's grandson, the editor explained. Following in his footsteps. Just graduated Annapolis, top of his class. Miller watched as General Marshall embraced his grandson before taking his place beside Major Kendrick's casket. Not at the front among the dignitaries, but as a pallbearer, shouldering his friend's weight one final time. Something broke inside Miller then, a wall of certainty about who deserved immediate respect and who needed to earn it. He'd been wrong, catastrophically wrong, not just yesterday but for decades. Later that afternoon, after the procession had departed, Miller returned to the empty funeral home. The memorial display Marshall had been arranging remained. Photos, medals, memories of a life of service. A small handwritten note caught his eye, in elegant script. The measure of a nation lies in how it treats all its heroes, not just those who fit our expectations. W.M. Miller stood silently before the display, then straightened his shoulders and offered something he should have given yesterday. A respectful salute to both the fallen major and the general who had taught him a lesson no training manual ever could. The greatest heroes often wear no uniform at all, but carry their honor in how they face both battlefields and prejudice with the same unflinching courage.